Each of these amazing Western artifacts before me today belong to Arthur William Merrifield, Theodore Roosevelt's friend, business and hunting partner in the Dakota Territory in the late 19th century. Some of these pieces were presented to Merrifield directly by Theodore Roosevelt in direct relation to his experiences in the American West in the 1880s and the 1890s. Arthur William Merrifield, better known as Bill Merrifield or William Merrifield, was actually a Canadian by birth. He was born and raised in Canada and then came to the American West in the late 1870s as a rancher, and he worked with the Ferris brothers on the Chimney Butte Ranch in the Dakota Territory. When Merrifield came to the West, it was still very wild and dangerous. If you look at the photos from the early ranch life, you can see it was a rugged and tough life. Merrifield was obviously a rough and tumbled Wild West figure, and if you look at the story of his life, you can see he's a man of the American West through and through. Merrifield only came to the West a few years before Theodore Roosevelt arrived in the early 1880s, but by that time, Merrifield is already a very established rancher, outdoorsman, hunter, and very experienced with the wild game of the West. And that is exactly what Theodore Roosevelt was looking for when he came there in the early 1880s. Roosevelt was seeking, adventure, excitement. He was looking for buffalo, grizzly bears, all the different big game the American West had to offer. And part of the reason Theodore Roosevelt was coming to the West and spending so much time there was because he had been through personal tragedies, ones that Merrifield could personally identify with. Shortly after Merrifield's first son was born, his wife actually died, and Merrifield had to leave him behind in Canada with his family so that he could continue his ranching life in the American West. Roosevelt famously lost both his mother and his first wife on the very same day, shortly after the birth of his daughter Alice. So he had tremendous loss, and he was seeking basically solace and adventure in the American West to try to kind of get through his grief. And he found that by going out onto the frontier with Merrifield on extensive, hunting expeditions, searching out the wildest, most dangerous game he could find. Merrifield took Theodore Roosevelt on his first grizzly bear hunt. Theodore Roosevelt is famously associated with bears thanks to the whole teddy bear nickname and whatnot that she didn't actually personally like. But this watch directly ties to that very first grizzly hunt. If you take a look at the inside of the case here, it is inscribed, "If it is a black bear, I can tree him. If it is a grizzly, I can bay him." That is a quote from Merrifield on that first grizzly hunt. Theodore Roosevelt was super excited about taking the bear. It was reported to be like 9 feet tall and 1,000 pounds, so a big bear. And he offered Merrifield as a reward either $150 or a gold watch, and Merrifield selected this historic watch. Because of his significance in American history and the fact that he was prolific in writing, we actually know quite a bit about this first hunting expedition. And the Theodore Roosevelt Center actually has the copy of Theodore Roosevelt's letter to his sister Mamie telling the story of this first hunt. On September 20th, 1884, he wrote, "I shall not soon forget the first one I killed. We had found where he had been feeding on the carcass of an elk, and followed his trail into a dense pine forest, fairly choked with fallen timber. While noiselessly and slowly threading our way through the thickest part of it, I saw Merrifield, who was directly ahead of me, sink suddenly to his knees and turn half around, his face fairly ablaze with excitement. Cocking my rifle and stepping quickly forward, I found myself face to face with the great bear, who was less than 25 feet off, not 8 steps. He had been roused from his sleep by our approach. He sat up in his lair and turned his huge head slowly toward us. At that distance, and in such a place, it was very necessary to kill or disable him at the first fire. Doubtless my face was pretty white, but the blue barrel was steady as a rock, as I glanced along it until I could see the top of the bead fairly between his 2 sinister-looking eyes. As I pulled the trigger, I jumped aside, out of the smoke, to be ready if he charged. But it was needless, for the great brute was struggling in the death agony, and as you will see when I bring home his skin, the bullet hole in his skull was exactly between his eyes, as if I had measured the distance with the carpenter's rule. These early hunting trips, hunting a grizzly bear, hunting a buffalo, going after pronghorn, all of these different hunting trips cemented the relationship between Theodore Roosevelt and William Merrifield. They became close friends for the rest of Roosevelt's life, even after Roosevelt returned back east and quickly climbed the rungs of power, going from, a low-level politician all the way to President of the United States within just a few years. During this whole time period, him and Merrifield remained very personally connected. Initially, these frontiersmen, Merrifield and the Ferris brothers, were, I'm sure, skeptical of this Eastern greenhorn with his spectacles, which weren't really a thing in the American West, some rich guy from the East coming in wanting to hunt. But he quickly became their friend and business partner. He sunk thousands of dollars into cattle ranching at the Chimney Butte Ranch, which became his Maltese Cross Ranch, and the Elkhorn Ranch that he started a few years later. Merrifield was both a partner in those ranches and an integral part of managing them. He was the foreman, as he's referred to in most of Theodore Roosevelt's writing, but he's also listed as the ranch manager. And as I mentioned, he had stakes in the business. From the beginning, he was one of the initial members of the ranch before Roosevelt was even involved, and he remained deeply involved even after Roosevelt returned to the East. So sometime during this period, we don't know the exact date, but sometime during that time period, while Roosevelt and Merrifield were deeply involved in ranching in the Dakota Territory, he actually presented Merrifield with this revolver and the holster rig that goes with it. If you take a look at the revolver, it is a classic Merwin Hulbert, frontier army. There's all kinds of different nicknames for these, in .44-40 Winchester centerfire. Really excellent gun for a man who's working the frontier, and it's got the classic, nearly full coverage Merwin Hulbert style engraving, which is, pretty spectacular. This is one of the finest Merwin Hulberts you're ever going to see, and it's definitely the most historic one I've ever dealt with. And if you take a look at the revolver, it's in really, really nice shape. And if you look right down the back strap, it is inscribed William Merrifield. So the revolver itself is already spectacular and exciting, but one of the things that's really cool about this set is that it comes with this holster rig. So the holster rig was also, according to the family, presented by Theodore Roosevelt, and it is a J.S. Collins & Company, Cheyenne, Wyoming made double loop holster with a cartridge belt. Like the revolver, it remains in really nice condition, especially considering these would have been worn and used by Merrifield as a rancher in the American West. So these are the early pieces of the story that we're telling with these items. You've got the watch, then you've got the revolver and holster rig, and then basically in the late 1880s, you've got Roosevelt. He's basically back east. He occasionally makes some visits to the west, but he spends a lot more time in the east as he's, working his way up the political rungs, and then eventually going off to fight in the Spanish-American War. During this time period, Merrifield and the Ferris brothers are still working for Roosevelt. Eventually, Merrifield sells out. The cattle industry had a serious decline later in the decade, so Merrifield moves to Montana, where he continues actually working as a rancher in a new ranch. But him and Roosevelt, despite not being business partners really anymore, remain close friends. You can see correspondence from Roosevelt to Merrifield, touching base with one another, talking about, the birth of children, talking about running for political office, talking about different things that are happening for them in their lives. And one of the things that happened is as Roosevelt climbed up the ladder and continued to write and talk about his adventures in the American West, some of his family members wanted to go to the West and go hunting as well. And that brings us to this really cool Winchester Model 1894 Special Order Takedown lever action rifle. The rifle comes also out of Merrifield's family. The family history indicates that it was given to Merrifield by one of the members of the Roosevelt family. Not Roosevelt himself, but he was almost certainly deeply involved because Roosevelt was obsessed with Winchesters. He had a bunch of Winchesters during his lifetime. Actually, when he gave Merrifield this watch, he gave him a Winchester 1876 that's also inscribed with the date for the first grizzly bear hunt. That's actually on display out west. You can see that one online as well. And if you take a look at this rifle, it's got a lot of the classic Theodore Roosevelt hunting rifle attributes. It's got a short magazine, pistol grip stock with a shotgun butt. Those are all features that Roosevelt liked. It's also got a feature that Roosevelt wasn't personally a fan of, but might have been something Merrifield specifically wanted, which is a tang-mounted peep sight. In the early 1900s, multiple of Roosevelt's nephews actually came out west to go hunting, and Merrifield played an important role. He was Roosevelt's key connection to the American West. So he hosted Monroe and Stuart Robinson, two of Roosevelt's nephews, for a hunt. And that is when we believe he received this rifle from the family. Unfortunately, during that visit, Merrifield actually had a fall and broke his wrist, so he wasn't actually able to personally guide the Robinson brothers on their hunt, but he still took the time and made the effort while injured to make other arrangements for others to guide them on their hunts. And Theodore Roosevelt personally wrote to him, thanking him for taking care of the boys and making sure they had a good time on their Western adventures like he had decades earlier with Merrifield. Roosevelt also personally wrote to Merrifield to make arrangements for another one of his nephews to come out and hunt in the American West. And if you read kind of into the letter and you listen to the tone of Roosevelt's letter, he's basically talking about how his other nephew was kind of a quieter, more meek boy, and Roosevelt's kind of trying to help send him out to the West, send him out on a hunt to help make a man out of him, to get him an experience on the frontier that he thinks will help change him for the better for the long run. And that's something Roosevelt really believed in. If you read through his writings, he talks about, the strenuous life, the idea that like working hard and suffering and experiencing hardship helps make you a stronger, better man, no matter what you're trying to do in life. Roosevelt went back east and spent a good chunk of his life as a politician, but he truly saw his experiences in the West with men like Merrifield as foundational for his later success. At the same time that Merrifield was making arrangements for Theodore Roosevelt's nephews to go on a hunt, he was also waiting to be sworn in as U.S. Marshal for Montana. That is a presidentially appointed position, and Merrifield wrote to Roosevelt when he became president asking him to be appointed into that position. And Roosevelt, wholeheartedly agreed. He talked to some of the politicians from Montana to try to make things work, and they basically agreed that once the current marshal's term ended, he could be sworn in as U.S. Marshal. Roosevelt obviously trusted Merrifield, so he had no reason to be concerned about his ability to do the job. So what we've got is this really cool U.S. Marshal's badge. You can see it's got Merrifield's name on it. Really nice condition for a Western used badge. And then what's really special is we don't have just the badge, but we've also got this early 1903 Colt pocket hammerless and this first now shoulder holster rig. Both of them are really cool pieces. We think about the American West, we tend to think about revolvers. We think about revolvers being used by the American police for decades after semi-automatics come out. But they were adopted by some men right away. If you read some of the writings from the time period, there were people that were really focused on what's the best firearms. And a Colt pocket hammerless like this would be an excellent sidearm for a U.S. Marshal who's not really supposed to be out there, running and gunning, but definitely could get into those situations. He needed to pack some heat. So he would have had this awesome early 1903 kind of tucked in underneath his jacket just in case he needed it. And Merrifield was very active as a U.S. Marshal. He was a Marshal from 1907 to 1911, a relatively short period of time. One of the more exciting adventures Merrifield went on was actually a very long distance journey as U.S. Marshal. He spent most of his adult life in Montana, the Dakotas, the American West. But as Marshal, he actually escorted personally some of the prisoners that were Chinese all the way to the West Coast, and then didn't just drop them off on a boat there. He got on the boat and escorted them all the way back to China. While on this trans-Pacific expedition, his boat actually ran aground, and he spent some time in Japan, and then they came back across the Pacific, and he returned to Montana and got back on his duties. A pretty big adventure for a guy who spent almost all of his life in the American West. He crosses the Pacific and goes to see a completely different culture than what he's used to, and then comes back, I'm sure, with a bunch of stories to tell. Merrifield also was involved in some of the kind of iconic Western stories you hear when you see Western movies or novels, but they also happen frequently in the American West, which was he was involved in tracking down a pair of thieves who robbed the train at gunpoint, blew open the safe, ended up stealing like $40,000, if I remember correctly, worth of cash, and then fled. Those guys partied it up with their new money and eventually got busted, arrested, taken to jail. The two thieves actually sawed their way out of jail and escaped. One of them is never seen again. The other thief reportedly says that guy died. The other one arrogantly actually takes a job with the railroads and is eventually rebusted and taken back. Merrifield is involved in his sentencing and then seeing him sent off to Leavenworth, where he spends the rest of his life. While Merrifield's going on all these grand adventures as U.S. Marshal, packing his 1903, wearing this badge, Theodore Roosevelt is president and watching from the east. He's keeping an eye via correspondence with people in the West on what Merrifield's up to. Upon learning of his good work from Judge William Hunt, Roosevelt wrote to him saying, "I cannot tell you how proud this made me feel. I want you to show this to your wife because she will be proud of it also." That little note just shows you how personally connected these two men were. He wasn't just writing to him in an official capacity, talking to him about doing his job. He was writing to him personally, talking about how personally proud he is of his friend, and knowing that his friend's wife would also be proud to know that the President of the United States is proud of her husband's work as U.S. Marshal. Theodore Roosevelt died in 1919. Merrifield lived another decade longer than his old hunting partner and became an important figure in Roosevelt's legacy as a man of the American West. He contributed heavily to the Theodore Roosevelt Memorial Association, including passing down several of Roosevelt's own guns to the association. Some of those are now on display in, national parks in the American West. So he was key in keeping that memory alive. And then if you read, some of the early biographies of Roosevelt in the American West, you will see Merrifield's name over and over and over again, because he was a key part of the story, and he was also a key figure in making sure that story was told and told authentically and properly, because he knew exactly what Roosevelt was doing in the American West. You can read the newspapers from the time period, and they sometimes are making fun of Roosevelt, they're implying he's a dandy or whatever. Merrifield knew Roosevelt was a man. He was a dude. He was out there hunting in the West with Merrifield through rugged conditions. He was out there helping on the roundups. He was working the ranch. He wasn't just some bigwig from the East who owned a ranch. He was living the Western life and became deeply close with Merrifield for the rest of his life. And each one of these pieces from the lamp collection passed down through Merrifield's family is a part of both men's life. You've got the watch from when Roosevelt first came to the American West. You've got the revolver and holster rig from their time ranching together in the Dakota Territories. You've got the rifle that is part of the later period of Merrifield's life in connection to the Roosevelt family, taking members of Roosevelt's family out on hunts. Roosevelt himself came back out and visited Merrifield and his wife multiple times. And then you've got the pistol, the shoulder holster rig, and the badge from his time as U.S. Marshal for Montana after being appointed by President Roosevelt. Each one of these pieces individually is an incredible Western artifact. Taken as a whole, this is one of those sets you just dream of. You think of guns like the Granville Stewart collection we had several years ago that kind of had a different piece from each part of his life. This is exactly like that. You think about the Fawcett collection we had recently that had different pieces tied to these amazing figures who did incredible things in the American West, and that is exactly what you have here before us. All of these pieces are part of the history of the American West, the establishment of ranching on the American frontier, and they're all going to be available in our inaugural auction down in Bedford, Texas this December, along with a ton of other incredible Western guns, icons of the American West, Pancho Villa, Bill Merrifield, and many others.